Today we are here with Marjorie Chauvel. She is the teacher at Stanford and is 94 years old. Today is March 17th, 2017. Thank you, Marjorie, for letting us interview you. We would like to begin with knowing a little bit about your growing up. Could you tell us where you were born and what year?
I was born in Washington, D.C. My father was in real estate at the time, and mother came over when she wanted to be educated in this country, and they wanted her to be educated. And so they went from Nanking to Japan, and from Japan they took the boat over to across the Pacific to Canada. Landed in Canada and took a train across Canada and ended up finally in Philadelphia. And that's where she met my father. And the way how she happened to meet my father was my grandmother was a sorority sister. And she had met my mother. And she thought mother was a perfect fit for her son. And this is a true story. And so she got them together. Soon after I was born, my mother wasn't well. And so they moved to California because they figured the weather would be much better in California than Washington, D.C., which it does. And we came west to Santa Barbara. And in Santa Barbara, my father continued his real estate work, but that was at the time of the Depression, and it was very difficult for him to get work, whereas he had such wonderful work in Washington, D.C. So we lived in a rented house for a long time. I have memories of very vague memories of being a tiny little girl. I had a brother and a sister that were both older. My sister was 7 years older and my brother was 5 years older. I was not ever very close to my sister, but I did a lot of things with my brother, which is interesting because we were so separated in our years. That I was kind of the favored child. I've never thought that was very fair. Probably because Dad wanted the harpist, and Mother and I had such a wonderful relationship together. But after we had been in Santa Barbara for a while, my mother and father bought a lot from Esther Clark. Now, Esther Clark was one of the old original doctors. She was a pediatrician and she started the Palo Alto Clinic. And she lived into her 90s. Was a very interesting woman who never married, was always very involved in her medical life. My life was always, I would say, concern or a part of harp. And the reason why I took up the harp was my father loved it. And he could not convince my older sister to do it. And he thought he wouldn't even ask my brother. So when I was 6 years old, he took me to the Methodist Church in Santa Barbara, and they had a harp ensemble of harpists playing. And after I sat fascinated listening to them, he said, "Now, dear, would you like to do that?" and here I am. That's what I've always told people when they ask me how I happened to start the harp, because it is an unusual instrument. And so a teacher was found for me in Santa Barbara, and I studied with Florence Lyons, who was an art teacher as well as a harpist. Not a wonderful harpist, or would I say a wonderful teacher, but she was adequate, and I studied with her until I was 13. At that time, Carlos Salzedo, who was noted at that time to being the finest harpist in the world, came on tour, and I was taken to hear his concert. And of course, I fell in love with it. I also met him, and I said to my father, I want to study with him. Well, I was too young to go at that age east by myself because he lived in New York, but he also taught at Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. And so what developed was Mother and Dad, because they'd been from Washington, D.C., said that they would take me east and that I would go back there so that I could get to the point where I could study with him and hopefully go to Curtis Institute, which was an all-scholarship school and still is. So when I was 15, we packed up and we went back for me to have an audition at that time to try to get into Curtis. I was still not ready for it. My teacher thought I was ready for it because it was a competitive audition, and I did not make it. And I remember coming back to the hotel room in tears, total tears. But I've always thought, oh my goodness, thank goodness I didn't make it, because I never would have met my husband, because I didn't know him by then. So we came back to Santa Barbara, and I had friends. I knew Art. All of us knew one another at that time. And he was student body president of Santa Barbara High School. And he was standing around with others and saying he was invited to the graduation dance in January. Now, he graduated in June. They had two graduations at that time. And he said, I don't know who to take. And somebody said, well, why don't you take Marjorie Gibson? And so he asked me to go, and we fell in love. And for 4 months, we dated constantly. I'm sure it was a first love that was a very sincere love, and because I was married to him for so many years. But then it was time for me to go to the East. And so that was a very sad time. I remember the last night just weeping and weeping. And matter of fact, he even wept. And the first summer, I went to study in the summer in Camden, Maine, where Carlos Salzedo had a home, and he taught lessons during the summer. And the second summer, Art came all the way to Camden, Maine to see me. And that was a wonderful opportunity for us to get together. I think all the years, I still have 100 letters that he wrote me that we never lost. There was something, he was not a musician, there was nothing in common. It was just the personality. We enjoyed doing things together. And I don't think we ever had a fight to speak of, or we had a very, very happy 65 years of marriage. He moved the harp for me too, which is another dedicated thing to do. So we had a very, very happy marriage, and after he worked for Kraft Foods, and after he retired, he said, I want to see the world. And I said to him, I thought you'd seen the world when you were in service. And he said, yes, but I want to see it in a different way. So every year I said, well, okay, you plan it. And every year we went to a different place. And we saw the world everywhere except Antarctica. And People have often said, well, he was not a musician. And I said, but I think this was one of the good things because I got a lot of publicity. My picture was in the paper. I had all kinds of publicity. And if you're married and your other person is a musician, because I got all the spotlight, it probably wouldn't have worked very well. When I was 13 and 14, I wasn't very popular in school. And the reason why I wasn't popular with my friends is because of all the publicity that I got and the beautiful dresses. It was the middle of the Depression. Most of us had one dress to wear to a dance. Today I don't think they wear, they probably wear pantsuits. But I had two. Now, that sounds strange to people today. But during the Depression, to have two long dresses was very unusual. And so I wasn't very popular with my friends for that reason. Also, the fact that I had write-up in the paper, my picture was in the paper, and I had write-ups. And I think the other part of it is that there are a lot of violinists, there are a lot of cellists, there are a lot of pianists, but there aren't very many harpists, you know. And so consequently, I've always had a lot of publicity, or people have said to me, oh, you're a harpist, you know, and that's because it's unusual. Florence Lyons.
Okay. And can you tell me a bit about her?
She was an art teacher, but she played the harp, and I studied with her my first 7 years because she was the only harp teacher in Santa Barbara. And the reason, I think I've already told you, the reason that I took up the harp was because my father wanted me to. Well, in those days, I didn't like the music I studied. I didn't like the music itself. That's why I liked Salzedo, because I loved the music that he played, and it was so different than what I was doing. And so that's one reason why I wanted to study with him. It wasn't so much the personality. I didn't know very much about him, but I will tell you a little bit about him. He was a French Basque. He came to this country from Paris, and he played, when he first came and he played with the New York Philharmonic. But then he started teaching, and during the years that I studied and the years that he was alive, he was the harpist of the world. I heard Salzedo on tour play, and I wanted to study with him. And that's the reason why I ended up in the East, because Mother and Dad, even though it was during the Depression, made it possible for me to go and study with him in the East. And while he thought he was going to make a lot of money selling real estate, the real estate market at that time, was during the Depression, was terrible. And I will tell you this, that the money, they sent me money for a while, and then after that they had to borrow money to see that I got it through. When I came back to California, and I was married, I told Art, the first concerts I made, I gave the money to my dad to pay them back for what they did. I had my choice when I went east. If I wanted to go to a private school, I had to go to a private school in Philadelphia, and I would have to study with Edna Phillips, because my mother and father couldn't afford to have me study with Salzedo and live in New York. So I had my choice of going to a public school, which I did, Julia Richmond, my last year, and I took in high school, and I lived alone in a room when I was 16 years old until I got into the Studio Club, which was a Y club, living club for artistic women. I lived from September until January alone, ate my meals in a restaurant at night for 40 cents for dinner, and walked to school so that I could study with Salzedo. And that's all my parents could afford. My memories probably are basically my summers in Maine, I loved going up there. It was a little more like California in the summertime, not in the winter. And I loved doing that. What we would do, different people would rent out their rooms to harpists during the summer. So he put me in this beautiful house way up on the hill that looked out over the whole bay. He wasn't going to have another Santa Barbara harpist unhappy. And then I would walk to my lesson. It was a 45-minute walk because we didn't have any cars. And I'd walk to my lesson once a week rather. And I studied 5 years with him in the summertime in Maine. 2 years in New York and 4 years at Curtis Institute.
Okay.
Curtis Institute is an all-scholarship school that was started by Mrs. Bach, who was of the Bach Publishing Company. What he did, he wrote music himself for the instrument, but then he also transcribed things, piano pieces, or the Harmonious Blacksmith was not written for the harp. And but then he wrote Scintillation, which was his masterpiece, and Chanson de la Nuit, which was another one that was a favorite. And I did a great deal of playing more when I came back. And what would happen was it helped us a lot when we were first married, because I made money and Art would stay home and take care of the children, and while I would go out and make some money.
What was your favorite piece of his? Do you remember?
Chanson de la Nuit.
Yes. Yes.
Which was his masterpiece. I loved Scintillation. It's much more difficult. But the chanson, I almost always played the Chanson de la Nuit. And to this day, I will play it for people if somebody wants to hear me play. I don't play much anymore.
What were some of the techniques that Salzedo taught you?
Techniques?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good question, because there are two techniques. Did you know that? Okay. He changed the technique. He studied in Philadelphia, and I've forgotten who he studied with, but he was a very well-known fine harpist. And his idea of the harp, because we don't have any pedal like you do on the piano, or a bow that can carry, or a flute that can carry a sound, how are you going to carry that sound? And so he changed what we call the Salzedo method, which is your hands move with the sound. And then they come back slowly. And you carry the sound in your hand. So if I play a chord, that chord is sounding all the time that my hands are moving. And then I come back. And this was his idea of how the harp should be played. So it was his method that started this. Many people copied it. Marcel Grangeny was another very outstanding French harpist. And they were great friends. But they were different in their ways. They taught differently. At first, I had met Marcel Grangeny. I don't know what there was about Salzedo that made me want to study with him. I'll tell you a little bit about him. And that was, in those days, I don't know whether it was true in this country, but European men or musicians were on the make all the time. And with a young girl, it was a problem. But I let him know very early. My mother and father were very, very strict with what I could do and what I was supposed to do to be a good person. And he found out very quickly that he wasn't going to get anywhere with me. He had enough others that would, because they thought they'd go further, you see, by getting into him. So what did I get to do? I got to take care of Jacques, and Jacques was the only child he ever had. And so I was designated to take care of Jacques until I got in Curtis. But I was very pure. But I'll tell you another thing, and that is, and now, you know, this is very prevalent. Maybe it was prevalent at that time, but sex was a terrible problem for any young girl. And see, when I was in the National Orchestral Association, I was the only girl in the orchestra. And I had a terrible time because I was young, but I had had this training. And I was able to continue with my music, and I will tell you honestly, I never had an affair with any musician. So these are things that I talk to my students about, that you don't have to do it to get somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I'm a good proof of it, that I didn't have to. He found somebody else. It was okay. I was lucky because he was married. He was married 3 times. And I was lucky because he was married to Marjorie Chauvel at that time and not having to prey upon his students. Well, okay, I'll tell you what happened. After the war, Art and I were married, and he didn't come from a wealthy family. His father was a head plumber at Ops Hardware in Santa Barbara, which was a very large hardware. He wanted to go to Stanford. And of course, they didn't have the money in those days. But after the war, they were given special treatment, and so he was able to come to Stanford. And so we became engaged, and he was coming up to Stanford, and I said, well, if we're not going to get married, I'm going to go to Maine for the summer. He said, we'll get married in April. He wasn't going to lose me. So we were married in April, and we came up to Stanford, and I immediately got a job.
Can you tell me?
They were thrilled to have, at that time, the music department was not what it is today. And I went to the music department, and they were thrilled to have me because they didn't have anybody to play in the orchestra. And so I played with them in the orchestra and gradually got students. And as I told you, the first student was my neighbor, who was a little boy that lived in the neighborhood. So sometimes they will come because they've heard about me. I'm fairly well known, I know that. And so some will come because they want to study with me, but they want to get a marketable education. And I've always felt it was a great privilege to be able to, because everybody that comes to Stanford is very intelligent, or they wouldn't be there. They don't necessarily come from a wealthy family because there are a lot of scholarships that are given there. Sometimes they will come because they've heard about me. I'm fairly well known, I know that. And so some will come because they want to study with me, but they want to get a marketable education. Most of my students will practice very hard and do very well.
Can you tell me a little bit about your practice life?
Yes, I practice 3 hours a day.
Still or back?
No, I don't anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Once in a while I sit down and play for myself. I had to practice a lot. When I was doing concert work, I had to do practice because you don't go out and play a concert when you haven't practiced. Mm-hmm. And also learning new pieces. Well, in the beginning, of course, it's position.
Okay.
It's hand position. After that, it's musicality. Teaching them, it's got to be interesting to play. In other words, I will sit down and say this. Now, I don't want you to play this prelude. Bum, 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 bum. No, I don't want you to play like that. And then I will sing it, or I'll sit and play it. And I'll play it with a lot of expression. And I said, people are not going to want to hear you play it if you just play it like that. You've got to play it musically. It's a natural thing. You either have it or you don't. It's a sensitivity that not everybody has. I have played when I've had people cry because I was so inspired to play it beautifully. I've had people say it brought tears to my eyes because I studied with Salzedo, and that's where you had to play.
Yeah. Did he demand a certain sort of expression?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, you know, the first lesson I had with him when I did was interesting. He had me play a chord, and he said, I want you to raise it out, and I want you to listen, listen, listen. And then play another chord and listen, listen, listen. This was what he was trying to get me to listen to what I was playing. Not just bum, 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 you see. But that music, because we have no pedal to extend the sound. The piano has a pedal, violin can expand it, flute can by the voice. The harp has no way of extending a sound. It's psychological. With your hand, you expand the tone less. Mm-hmm. And you have to see two people doing the opposite to understand it. If you don't play with sensitivity, there's no use playing.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Would you say you have any other important things that you focus on?
You play only what you're capable of playing and playing well. And I don't give anything to anybody that's beyond what their ability is. And then I make them stay with it until it's good. You don't just learn it and put it away. You get it so you could play it for a program. It gives them something to work towards. Mm-hmm. If they don't have anything to work towards, well, what's the use? You know, you need a goal. Anything you do, you need a goal. If it's in sports, you need a goal. If it's in music, you need a goal. Anything, you need a goal. You don't just do it. I will tend to start them out on a lower level. In other words, playing. See, I've always had home recitals before I had one at school, or a major one. And that gives them a chance to get rid of some of their nerves and to know what it's going to feel like. That's the big thing. Because it feels a lot different than when you're having a lesson. Because I try not to make them nervous. Naturally, some are, but most of them aren't. I'm a friend to them. And I don't scold them. If they don't do it well, I tell them, you're wasting your time and your parents' money because you're not getting any better. So why bother to study if that's the situation, If you think because the harp is unusual you're going to get by, you're not. And you are going to get to do things that nobody else is going to get to do. But you've got to work for it. And if you don't want to do that, then don't waste your time. It costs a lot of money to study the harp. Harps cost a lot, lessons cost a lot. And so therefore, if you're not going to work, there's no use you doing it. You're wasting your parents' money.
So what would you say some of your greatest gifts or legacies to your students are?
I'm a friend to them. I think that's it. I'm not strict to the point. I'm not strict like some teachers are. I try to win them through love, and they're wanting to do it themselves, and they're wanting to be recognized as being good. And there are no threats in what I do. And if you don't practice, why waste your parents' money? You know, it's interesting. I've had people that have looked me up after 20 years because it's an unusual instrument. There's another thing too. I've always said I teach more than harp. I try to teach them a good life. I talk to them about a lot because today it's probably prevalent. But having been exposed to Salzedo and the problems that a young girl had with conductors or Salzedo with sex was a problem. And so I've tried to point out to them, because I came from such a religious family, that you don't have to do that to get ahead. See, a lot of people think that that's part of it, and it isn't a part of it. I had no problem with it, because Salzedo could find somebody else. So in many ways, I've always said I have a lot of children. Harp children, I guess. Why did I keep it up? It's a good question. Probably because we were married during the Depression, and I was able to make money, and it helped a lot. So what we did was salted away one of what I made and lived on what Art made, working for Kraft Foods. As far as my music and what I have done with it, I started teaching very early, only because there weren't many people around and someone else wanted to have their... Well, Joel Andrews was my first student. He lived in the neighborhood, and he was about 6 to 8 years old. And I was 13 or 14. So that's where I began learning to teach. But it was a good way to do it, because there was no pressure on me. And again, I'm still at Stanford, and the head of the department said, you know, now you're in your 90s, do you still want to teach? And I said, as long as I'm well, and the students feel like they're getting something for me, I want to. I'm still driving a car. I live alone. At that time, I was living alone in my home before I came to the terraces. And so they said, well, as long as you want to stay, you can stay as long as you want.